A brilliant sun cast long shadows over the rubble of what had once been the nerve center of the Graian Dominion's eastern front. The war, it was said, had officially ended only hours ago, punctuated by the cataclysmic downfall of the Dominion's great fortress on the planet Genna 4. Smoldering embers drifted upward like morose fireflies, and to the victor belonged the spoils of that final conquest. Jack Grayson, captain of the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, stood alone on the ruins of a battered courtyard. Deep cracks marred the once polished marble under his boots. His weary eyes took in the aftermath of humanity's triumph. Fallen spires, the last illusions of Graian invincibility ground into dust, and the hush that followed centuries of conflict. He could hear the rasp of his own breath within his combat helmet, each exhalation a reminder of how close he had come to death. This was not a glorious battlefield reminiscent of historical epics. Instead, it was the tattered remainder of an ancient planet forced to host a war not of its choosing. Humanity and the Graian Dominion had clashed here for the final time. Peace, if such a word still held meaning, now hung heavy in the smoky air. General Rios, leader of the Terran forces in this sector, approached Jack with a mechanical stiffness. His uniform was dusty, singed at the edges, and spattered with the blackish-red residue characteristic of Graian blood. The general eyed Jack with a measured respect. There were few warriors whose names glowed as brightly in the annals of this war as Jack Grayson's. Jack had piloted the last assault on the orbital ring, disabling the Dominion's planetary shields and paving the way for the ground troops. "We did it," said Rios, voice husky from shouting commands through the night. "The Dominion has fallen. What remains of their leadership is in custody or otherwise disposed of." Jack merely nodded. He felt no exultation, no relief. Victory in war was always a hollow thing. 1,000 swirling emotions churned within him, none of them purely joyous. As the Terran soldiers moved among the rubble, searching for survivors and securing them, Jack was startled to see a small group of prisoners under guard, their wrists bound by luminous Terran energy shackles. General Rios glanced at them and then clapped Jack on the shoulder. "We owe our victory to you, Grayson. I spoke with command, and they agreed you deserve something more, something beyond medals and parades." His tight smile held a hint of bitterness. "We found survivors in the fortress. Some are high-ranking Graian officers, but among them are a few trophies." Jack's gaze flicked to the group of prisoners, and he saw a figure in the midst of them, a slender, blue-skinned woman with the telltale large, dark eyes of the Graian species. She knelt, her head bowed in silence, her long, midnight blue hair draping over shackled wrists. Rios cleared his throat. "Command seized them as spoils of war. It's standard procedure on the frontier worlds. The heads of the Dominion kept slaves from conquered species themselves. The irony is not lost on me. But since you led the final assault, you get first claim." He gestured to the bound aliens. "Pick any. Command will authorize it." Jack stared at him, uncertain how to respond. His entire life had been spent protecting Earth from threat, defending the ideals he believed humanity embodied: strength, courage, compassion. The taking of slaves was a Graian practice, something he had sworn to end. His throat tightened at the bitter realization that, in winning the war, humanity had begun to emulate the very tyranny it despised. Yet, refusing the gift could be viewed as an insult to command. While he wrestled with his conscience, Rios marched over to the prisoners and beckoned for the female Graian. Her keepers hauled her to her feet. She did not protest as she was pushed forward, but her dark eyes flickered with a silent defiance. Though her posture remained submissive, something about her manner suggested she would have fought or fled if she'd seen any hope in it. "Her name is Zell," Rios said. "We recovered her from the Dominion's engineering wing. She's clever, from what I hear. A prize technician. She's your reward, Grayson." His voice slid into the dryness of forced enthusiasm. "A symbol of your victory." Jack froze. The mere sight of her in shackles, shackles that glowed with Terran technology, brought bile to his throat. She was a living being, not a piece of equipment. His human decency warred with the harsh political reality of the moment. To him, the greatest moral failing would be to accept a slave. Yet, if he refused, she might be handed over to others far less merciful. Without another word, Jack closed the distance and gently took Zell by the wrist. The shackles thrummed with energy, reminding him of his complicity in this travesty. "I'll take her," he said quietly, though his heart pounded with shame. "But I won't keep her in chains." At that, Rio stiffened. "That's up to you. Once the paperwork is done, she's yours to handle as you see fit. I'd advise caution, though. She's still the enemy." Jack turned away, ignoring the general's warning. He led Zell through the rubble, scanning the horizon for his starship, the Maelstrom, which rested on a nearby landing platform. During the entire walk, Zell kept her head bowed, though he sensed her watchful eyes and the tension in her posture. She expected a certain treatment, and when it did not come, when no harsh words or cruel hands descended, she seemed unsure how to react. They reached the battered hulk of the Maelstrom, a Corvette-class vessel that had carried Jack through countless battles. Its metallic sides were scarred with burn marks and projectile gouges, but it still stood sturdy in the post-war gloom, loyal as an old steed. Jack paused at the boarding ramp. He held the shackles control device in his hand, a small piece of Terran tech that could disengage or tighten the energy bands. A press of his thumb would free her. "Zell," he said softly, clearing his throat to find words. "We're leaving. You're free now. Go or stay. I won't force you to do anything." The battered hull of his ship glimmered in the receding sunlight. Zell raised her face to look at him for the first time. It was an unspoken question. Would he truly keep his word? Would he treat her as the Terran overlords treated other prisoners? Her eyes glowed with that shimmering, azure hue characteristic of the Graian people. Jack took a measured breath and pressed the release. In a crackle of dissipating energy, the shackles fizzled out, freeing her wrists. The bluish glow vanished, leaving faint circular burns on her skin. Zell hissed softly, rubbing her wrists. He braced himself for her to run. Maybe she would vanish into the city's ruins, or find other survivors, or fade into the endless desert that ringed the horizon. But she did not. Instead, with graceful caution, she followed him up the boarding ramp, into the metal corridor that led to the Maelstrom's cockpit. Perhaps she knew there was nowhere else to go. Perhaps, in his eyes, she saw compassion, an emotion so rarely displayed in the final days of this brutal war. Whatever her reason, Zell stepped into the ship, and the ramp hissed shut behind them. Thus, a most unexpected partnership was born. Inside the Maelstrom, dim emergency lighting hummed along the corridors. The vessel had taken heavy fire in the battle for Guinea, and many systems remained in disrepair. Jack deactivated the last of his own armor, letting the chest plates clatter to the deck. Exhaustion weighed on him like gravity turned cruel. Zell stood a few steps away, observing him with silent curiosity. She was slender, clad in a tattered gray shift that bore the insignia of the Dominion's engineering division. Patches of grime and dust stained her smooth, sky-tinted skin. Yet, even in disarray, she carried herself with an air of quiet dignity, one that belied her newly enslaved status. Jack pressed a switch on the wall, attempting to power up the ship's lights. Sparks erupted with a flash, sending a swirl of acrid smoke into the air. Clearly, the Maelstrom was in worse shape than he'd hoped. He muttered a curse and made his way toward the cockpit. Zell followed at a short distance. "Power's out on half the decks," Jack said, mostly to himself. "We'll need to fix that before we can go anywhere." She said nothing. Her gaze trailed over the bulkheads. Then, she pointed to a scorched power conduit near the ceiling. Jack turned to see where she indicated. "Yes," he murmured. "The main lines must be burned through." She lifted her hands to sign something, then hesitated when she realized he might not understand Graian sign language. The war had taught humanity to decipher some Graian gestures, but her meaning was not entirely clear. Jack, bridging the silence, beckoned her to follow him to the cockpit. The corridor opened into a cramped flight deck with 2 chairs, a central console, and wide viewing ports rimmed with carbon scoring. The canopy revealed a once grand city now broken. The last edges of sunset painted the horizon in purples and golds, a reminder that life continued despite the day's tragedy. Jack ran diagnostic checks on the battered console. Display screens crackled. A few flickered to life, showing the engine's damaged state. He frowned. Hyperdrive offline. Shields offline. Even atmospheric thrusters were at partial capacity. If an emergency forced a swift departure, the Maelstrom would not comply. He felt movement beside him. Zell had slipped into the co-pilot seat and was tapping softly on a smaller console. Lines of code in the Graian script scrolled across the screen. A string of complex numbers and technical symbols flew by. Jack recognized a partial systems readout, but it was from the Dominion's perspective. She was analyzing the damage in her own language, diagnosing exactly which components needed repair. He hesitated. Should he trust her? She was, after all, a Graian. He had spent years learning not to trust any of them. But now her expertise might be the difference between being stranded here or getting off Gina, for before more trouble arrived. With a slow exhale, Jack let her continue, deciding her fate and his were temporarily aligned. If he died here, so would she. Finally, Zell rose from the seat and motioned for him to follow. She led him out of the cockpit and down to the ship's secondary access corridor, near the cramped engineering bay. Sparks flickered from overhead cables. The stale smell of burned electronics filled the confined space. She bent over a panel, touched a broken fuse, and looked at Jack expectantly. She wants me to fix it, he thought, or at least fetch her the tools. Wordlessly, he found the portable toolkit, gingerly handing over a handful of fuses and cables. Zell's skillful fingers made short work of the repairs. In minutes, the overhead lights flared to life, illuminating the corridor with a steady glow. Jack felt a surprising sense of relief as the ship's hum steadied, the power regulation smoothing out. When she finished, Zell wiped her hands on her tattered clothing, the ghost of a weary satisfaction crossing her features. Jack realized in that moment they shared something. They were both battered by war, both longing for normalcy in a galaxy turned mad. He nodded, offering a simple word of gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. Her dark eyes blinked, and a faint tilt of her head suggested curiosity. Perhaps she recognized the kindness in his tone. Still, no spoken response came forth. That night, they made makeshift accommodations. Jack offered Zell his cramped sleeping quarters, a small cabin behind the cockpit, though he wasn't certain she would trust him enough to rest there. He himself curled up on the tattered co-pilot seat, drifting into a restless doze filled with half-remembered battle scenes. In the lull of darkness, the battered maelstrom stood as a fragile refuge. Outside, the remnants of war crackled under the night sky. Morning on Gina, for was a bleak affair. A sulfuric wind carried the odor of burnt metal and scorched earth. In the distance, plumes of smoke signaled pockets of the city still aflame. Jack woke with a stiff back and a layer of dust on his jacket. He found Zell already awake, examining the interior hull plating for cracks. They spent the next hours in a halting choreography, Jack searching for salvageable parts in the city ruins, Zell remaining aboard the maelstrom to conduct repairs. Each time he returned, he found new sections of the ship had come to life under her skilled hands. Word of humanity's victory spread, and roaming squads of Terran soldiers occasionally crossed paths with Jack in the rubble. Some recognized the famed Captain Grayson and greeted him with exuberance or requests for autographs. Others eyed him suspiciously, having heard rumors that he had taken a Graian slave, yet apparently refused to use her as such. But none dared confront him directly. On one trip, Jack stumbled upon a half-demolished Graian library. Broken data tablets littered the marble floor. He felt a twinge of sorrow. How many centuries of knowledge had these tablets contained? Possibly lost forever. Though he knew little of the Graian language, he gathered a few that looked intact, thinking Zell might find a use for them. By the time he returned to the maelstrom with the tablets, midday light was flooding the cockpit. He stepped on board to see Zell seated at a half-disassembled console, her face streaked with grease, her long blue hair tied into a messy knot. When she saw him enter, she stood warily, unsure of his mood. He offered the tablets. "I found these in a library," he said. "I don't know if they'll help with the repairs, or if there's something else you want from them. But they're yours." Her expression flickered from guarded to something close to wonder. She took the tablets gently and held them to her chest, then gave him the faintest nod of thanks. In that moment, the tension between them loosened a fraction. Still, it took more than gestures of trust to bridge the chasm of war. At times, they collided in small misunderstandings. Jack attempted to show her a Terran control interface, only to realize that Graian engineering used a different logic entirely. Zell, in turn, grew frustrated when he hovered too close, misreading his presence as an attempt to supervise her under threat. Their communication relied on pantomime, gestures, and the occasional attempt at words from both sides. Slowly, they developed a fragile means to convey meaning. Yet an undercurrent of shared purpose bound them. Jack sensed that Zell, with her engineering expertise, wanted to fix the maelstrom. She took pride in the work. He, for his part, had no desire to treat her as a captive. He wanted only to leave Gina behind and begin the next chapter of his life, away from the howling ghosts of war. As the days stretched on, one corridor after another regained power, lighting, or life support. The cargo bay doors hissed open with newly restored hydraulics. The water recycling system churned to a functional hum. Even the battered hyperdrive coughed in the engine room, as though awakened from a long coma, though it would still require careful calibration. Jack watched Zell working, reminded of the countless times he had witnessed Terran engineers do the same. She was no lesser being. If anything, the war had proven the Graians to be formidable equals, but twisted leadership on both sides had made them mortal foes. By nightfall, a flicker of hope coursed through the quiet corridors. The maelstrom might yet fly again. Jack settled in for another restless sleep. Outside, the battered city offered little solace. Strange how quickly he had grown accustomed to Zell's silent presence aboard his vessel. Without her, the ship might have remained a motionless tomb. Jack woke to the sound of shouting. At first, he thought it was a dream. Then he realized it came from outside the ship. Bolting upright, he grabbed his blaster pistol and raced for the cargo bay. Zell was already there, crouching behind a crate, her eyes keen. Through the open cargo ramp, a trio of Terran soldiers stood with weapons drawn. A short, stocky lieutenant was yelling, "Come out. We know you're harboring a Graian." Jack straightened, holstering his pistol but keeping a defensive stance. "State your business," he barked, "and lower your weapons." The lieutenant sneered. "Captain Grayson, we heard a rumor you had yourself a little trophy. Some of the men say you're going soft, letting that alien roam free. My squad and I would like to see for ourselves." "This is my ship, Lieutenant," Jack said icily. "If you have complaints, file them through command. Otherwise, you're trespassing." A momentary flash of defiance crossed the soldier's face. "With all due respect, sir, it's no secret. We're just ensuring no harm comes to the Terran cause. That Graian could be a spy, sabotaging your ship from within." "She's not sabotaging anything. Now back off." Jack felt the simmer of anger. Peace or not, bigotry lingered. "Our orders are to secure Gina. 4. Not to provoke new conflicts." The lieutenant peered past Jack, looking for Zell. "So you do have her in here," he muttered. "I'm sure command would want to know." Jack stepped forward. "Lieutenant, I have direct authorization from General Rios. She is under my jurisdiction. If you want to question that, let me know. Otherwise, take your men and go." "That's an order." For a tense moment, no one moved. The lieutenant's face contorted in frustration. Finally, he spat on the ground. "Yes, sir." He motioned to his men. They backed away, cursing under their breath as they turned and left the hangar. When the echo of their boots had faded, Zell emerged from behind the crate. Her expression was shuttered, as though bracing for some new betrayal. Jack set aside his anger. "Don't worry. I'll protect you," he said, surprising himself with the fervency of his words. He realized that, whether or not Zell understood every syllable, the protective vow was for his own conscience as well as for her. She dipped her head in cautious acknowledgement, her eyes lingering on him with something akin to gratitude. Then she returned to the engine room, presumably to continue her repairs. Jack forced himself to unclench his fists. The war's embers still burned, and prejudices on both sides would not vanish overnight. Over the following days, an unspoken camaraderie formed. Jack's war duties were minimal now that the official conflict had ended. General Rios and the Terran hierarchy had bigger tasks, stabilizing Gina. 4. Rounding up Dominion survivors, and establishing a provisional government. Jack, nominally still a hero in their eyes, was left alone to recover in his own way. He spent hours each day assisting Zell with repairs. Though she worked quietly, her every movement revealed deep expertise. They managed, through a halting mixture of words, gestures, and the occasional diagram, to improve their communication. Sometimes, in a moment of quiet curiosity, Zell tapped the side of her head as if to ask about a Terran device or protocol. Jack did his best to explain. One evening, she was on the floor of the engine bay, carefully aligning the hyperdrive matrix. The overhead lighting cast a pale glow on her features. Jack knelt beside her, handing over a fresh spool of cable. Their eyes met. For a moment, the tension of their differing species receded, replaced by the ease of coworkers. Jack dared to speak a Graian word he had learned from a translator device in a half-ruined marketplace. "You are you?" he ventured, which he believed meant safe or secure. Her eyes lit with mild surprise. She repeated the word, but with subtle correction in her tone, an adjustment in accent. He tried again, repeating her pronunciation. A hint of a smile curved her lips, the first semblance of a smile he had ever seen from her. They proceeded to exchange more words. She taught him how to say power and engine in Graian. He taught her the Terran equivalents. Though the war had severed countless lives, in this tiny corner of the galaxy, a bridge was being built, one fragile word at a time. When at last the hyperdrive flickered to life, vibrating with contained energy, Jack and Zell both let out a sigh of relief. One big hurdle remained: realignment of the quantum stabilizer, an advanced piece of technology that had been half destroyed. If they repaired it, the Maelstrom could jump to faster-than-light travel, leaving Gina 4 behind for good. Yet, behind his growing bond with Zell loomed a question Jack could not easily answer. Once they were able to depart, would he leave her among her own kind, presuming any enclaves of free Graians remained? Or would she want to stay with him, forging some new path forward? He did not know. Perhaps she did not know either. Their progress was disrupted abruptly one morning when Jack received an urgent call on his communicator. "Grayson," came the crackling voice of General Rios. "We have trouble. A Graian holdout force has been spotted near the southern deserts. They've begun attacking our field camps. We need every available warrior to secure the perimeter." Jack grimaced. The war was officially over, but old loyalties and resentments did not vanish overnight. Graian holdouts, led by surviving Dominion commanders, refused to surrender. "Acknowledged," Jack replied. He left the Maelstrom after a terse explanation to Zell, unsure if she caught the details, but certain she understood the nature of battle. He joined a Terran convoy headed south, and for 2 days they engaged in skirmishes with desperate Graian squads. It was an ugly conflict. The holdouts fought with the reckless abandon of cornered animals. Civilians, Graian or Terran, were caught in the crossfire. Jack found himself commanding a strike team at a desert outpost. Blistering winds whipped the sand, making visibility a challenge. Explosions rumbled through the gloom, and tracer fire illuminated the swirling dust. In a nighttime assault, the holdouts managed to flank one of the Terran supply lines. Alarms blared. Men and women shouted in confusion. Jack cursed as bullets tore across the encampment. By the time dawn light pushed aside the darkness, the holdouts had vanished, leaving behind craters, wrecked vehicles, and wounded soldiers. Despite the chaos, Jack gleaned a crucial piece of intelligence. The Graian holdouts had a hidden fortress in the desert canyons. They were rallying there, planning to strike again. Word spread that some Terran captives had been taken. The atrocities of war marched on, even after the official ceasefire. After another day of fruitless searching, General Rios gave orders to regroup in the capital city. Jack took a shuttle back to Gina 4's battered metropolis, feeling drained and demoralized. Why did the cycle of violence persist? When he finally stepped onto the Maelstrom again, his battered armor reeking of dust and sweat, Zell hurried to him with wide, alarmed eyes. She motioned vigorously to the medkit stowed in the corner. Jack looked down, only then noticing the deep slash across his arm. Blood stained his uniform. He had been so numbed by adrenaline he scarcely felt it. She pulled him to a crate and gestured for him to sit. Carefully, she peeled the shredded sleeve back to reveal the wound. Then she administered a bandage, her hands gentle and efficient. Jack gritted his teeth, feeling the sting of antiseptic. Softly, she spoke her first true word in Terran, the single syllable trembling on her lips. "Pain?" He blinked in surprise. "A little," he murmured, unprepared for the surge of emotion that accompanied hearing her attempt his language. "Nothing I can't handle." She continued, tending the wound in silence, her brow furrowed in concentration. The faint scars on her own wrists, where the shackles had once burned, were a stark reminder of her imprisonment. Yet here she was, caring for a Terran soldier. The war felt increasingly senseless in that moment. Later that night, as he drifted into a restless sleep, Jack realized they had crossed an intangible boundary. No longer was she merely the enemy or the enslaved. Zell had become a companion in adversity, a companion who had saved him from further suffering. And maybe, just maybe, he was helping save her, too. Weeks slipped by. Guinea's war-torn landscape began showing scant signs of renewal. A few enclaves of Graian civilians stepped forward, seeking a fragile truce with the Terrans. General Rios took official possession of the capital city, overseeing the distribution of aid. The holdout forces in the desert were reduced to sporadic raids. During this time, Jack and Zell completed most of the Maelstrom's internal repairs. The quantum stabilizer was nearly fixed, lacking only a final alignment sequence and a handful of specialized Graian parts. The question of leaving the planet hovered over Jack like an unspoken vow. Where could they go? Earth? Another colony? He considered the possibility that Zell might wish to seek out survivors of her own people. But from all news, the Dominion was fractured beyond repair, with no centralized government to speak of. One morning, Jack awoke to find Zell rummaging through supply crates. She looked at him with urgency. She formed a circle with her thumb and forefinger, then pointed to the engine room, as if to say, "We need something else for the repairs." He realized, through half-formed Graian words and broken Terran, that she needed a specialized data crystal to finalize the quantum stabilizer's calibrations. Such crystals were rare, used primarily by Graian engineers. Locating one in the city's black market might be possible, if one knew the right people. Jack sighed, rubbing the stubble on his chin. "All right," he said. "We'll try to find it. Come with me." They ventured into the city's labyrinthine underbelly. War had reduced many buildings to crumbling shells, but certain market districts still bustled, thriving off desperation and need. A hush fell whenever Jack entered an area, for Terrans were at once protectors and conquerors in the eyes of the locals. Zell, with her blue skin and Graian features, drew looks of suspicion and sometimes hatred. Hostile stares from both Terran and Graian passers-by told them they were unwelcome. Both sides saw them as a betrayal. Nonetheless, Jack pressed on, shoulders tense. Eventually, they found an old Graian merchant rumored to have a secret stash of engineering components. Initially, the merchant refused to deal with a Terran, but Zell stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Graian. Her tone was assertive but measured, emphasizing that she needed the part to fix a starship. The merchant's eyes flicked warily between them. At last, he parted a curtain behind his stall, revealing a small trove of black market goods. Within dusty crates, Jack spied an iridescent blue crystal about the size of a child's fist. Zell's eyes lit in recognition. That was it, the missing link to get the Maelstrom's hyperdrive fully operational. The merchant demanded a steep price in Terran currency, or else some Terran weapons. Jack had neither. Instead, he bargained away an old Terran encryption device he no longer needed, sweetening the deal with some rations he carried in his pack. Satisfied, the merchant handed over the crystal. Zell cradled it in her hands like a precious jewel. Tension eased in Jack's chest. They had found the final piece of the puzzle. A triumphant relief flooded him. Soon, the Maelstrom could take flight. Their return to the ship was uneventful. The city's murmurs of conflict remained at a distance, though occasionally the wail of sirens and rumble of distant weapons reminded everyone that the desert holdouts had not given up. Zell wasted no time installing the crystal in the quantum stabilizer housing. Jack assisted with the final calibrations, reading from a battered Graian to Terran engineering guide. Sweat beaded on his forehead from the concentration required. The device hummed to life, glowing with gentle pulses of blue and violet. A shimmer of invisible energy rippled through the engine room. He checked the readouts. "It's online," he said quietly. A wave of relief mixed with adrenaline coursed through him. They could leave now, jump to wherever they pleased. A hush settled. Zell stepped back from the console, looking to Jack with a question in her eyes. Now what? He contemplated the scope of that question. The galaxy had changed. They were free to chart their next course. But that freedom came with unknown risks. If they returned to Earth, Zell would face prejudice from those who still considered all Graians to be the enemy. If they stayed on Guinea, they might find themselves entangled in the last throes of a war neither wanted any part of. If they sought out other Graian enclaves, would Zell even be welcomed? given her time in Terran custody? He sighed, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Where do you want to go? He asked, though he knew she couldn't fully grasp the Terran words. He tried repeating a few phrases in her language, stumbling over the syllables. Her brow wrinkled in concentration as she tried to comprehend. Before they could conclude this fateful discussion, the ship's comm crackled to life. A faint but urgent voice came through. Attention. This is Captain Moreau of the Terran Ground Force. We need reinforcements at once. The holdouts. They have, repeating. Static garbled the transmission. Jack hurried to the cockpit to boost the signal. A few adjustments later, the voice came clear. Repeat. This is Captain Moreau. The Graian holdouts have taken prisoners from the Terran command post near the desert canyons. They threaten to execute them within hours unless we withdraw from Guinea for entirely. General Rios is requesting all available hands to help with a rescue operation. Jack's jaw clenched. So it wasn't over. Not yet. A pang of resolve surged through him. Terran troops, many of them his friends, were in danger. Could he turn his back? Could he simply flee? No. Duty still bound him. He glanced toward Zell, who stood by the cockpit door, her expression concerned. They're holding prisoners, he said softly. I can't leave them to die. Zell hesitated, eyes shifting between him and the comm console. Then, in halting Terran, she spoke words that startled him. Fight together? Her meaning was clear. She had chosen not to run from this. Jack felt an odd swell of gratitude. Though they were from opposite sides of a once bloody divide, they now stood on the same side of a moral imperative. He nodded. Yes, together. Jack lifted the maelstrom off the cracked landing platform, the thrusters roaring, dust swirling beneath the hull. Despite battered external plating, the ship flew with renewed vigor. Zell manned the co-pilot station, eyes scanning the readouts. She seemed anxious, but determined. They navigated low over Guinea 4's desert, following coordinates from Captain Miro's incomplete transmission. Deep canyons cut through the arid expanse, forming a labyrinth. Over the next ridge, Jack spotted a cluster of Terran vehicles pinned down by sniper fire. An outcropping of Graian gun emplacements spat plasma bolts at them. We'll draw their fire, Jack called, banking the ship. Cannon blasts thumped against the maelstrom's shielding. Zell calmly rerouted power to reinforce the forward deflectors, her deft hands moving in sure, practiced motions. A squad of Terran soldiers seized the opening. They scrambled behind cover, returning fire. Jack circled, unleashing a strafing barrage from the ship's ventral cannons. Explosions dotted the canyon floor. The Graian gunners scattered. After the immediate threat abated, Jack landed behind a rocky outcrop. The ramp lowered, and he sprinted onto the sands to join the Terran squad, rifle in hand. Zell followed a few paces behind, having donned some of Jack's spare body armor, which barely fit her lean frame but offered a semblance of protection. They were greeted with surprise and suspicion, especially once the soldiers recognized Zell's blue skin. But the chaos of combat left little room for argument. Captain Moreau, a worn-looking officer with dust-caked features, jerked his chin. Grayson, we're pinned down. The hostages are inside that cliff bunker. There's a small opening around the side we can use to breach. A barrage of plasma fire forced them all to duck. Jack gritted his teeth. We'll go? Cover us. He glanced at Zell, who nodded fiercely. Under the roar of covering fire, Jack and Zell sprinted across the open ground to the bunker's side entrance. The door was sealed with a heavy Graian lock. Zell dropped to her knees, studying the mechanism. Within seconds, she pried open a control panel and began working the wires. Sparks flashed. The door hissed open. Inside, the corridor was dimly lit, strewn with crates and cables. Angry shouts erupted as a handful of Graian holdouts fired at them from deeper within. Jack returned fire, pressing forward. Beside him, Zell knelt, carefully picking her shots with a Graian sidearm she had taken from a fallen guard. Her aim was precise. They advanced room by room, clearing the bunker of hostiles. The final chamber revealed a row of Terran prisoners, wrists bound, slumped against the wall. One was wounded. The others stared in shock at their rescuers. When Zell stepped into the light, the prisoners recoiled in confusion, expecting cruelty from the familiar shape of a Graian. But Jack's presence, and her swift slicing through their bonds, convinced them otherwise. A Graian officer lunged from the shadows, weapon raised. Before Jack could fire, Zell intervened, using a quick maneuver to disarm him. The officer spat curses, calling her a traitor. Zell's expression remained resolute as she slammed the officer to the ground, knocking him unconscious. In that instant, the final illusions of enemy lines dissolved for Jack. Here was Zell, once a prisoner in Terran shackles, now risking her life to save Terran hostages from her own species' extremist holdouts. The war had forced them all into moral complexities. But Zell, by her actions, had chosen to side with life over vengeance. They ushered the freed prisoners out through the corridor, exchanging gunfire with remaining Graian insurgents. Once back outside, Terran medics hurried to treat the wounded. The holdouts, realizing they had lost the advantage, began a hasty retreat, scattering into the canyon network. With the hostages safely extracted and the holdouts in retreat, the Terran forces breathed a collective sigh of relief. Captain Moreau clasped Jack's hand. "We owe you." And he looked uncertainly at Zell, who stood off to the side, rechecking her borrowed weapon. "We owe her, too." Jack could sense the swirl of emotions in the Terran ranks. Gratitude, confusion, lingering animosity, everything tangled in a messy knot. But for the moment, a fragile acceptance prevailed. Zell had proven herself. They returned to the Maelstrom. Once airborne, Jack turned the ship back toward the city. Exhaustion weighed on him, but an undercurrent of victory fueled his spirit. Beside him, Zell monitored the ship's status. When their gazes met, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They had confronted an old war and chosen a new path. The rescue mission sent ripples through Guinea's battered populace. Rumors spread of a Graian who fought alongside Terrans. Some called it an abomination, others hailed it as a sign of hope. The Dominion holdouts, scattered and weakened, posed no major threat now. A tenuous peace began to settle. Within a week, General Rios officially declared that the final holdouts had either surrendered or gone into hiding. Terran command prepared to withdraw large portions of its forces, leaving only a small garrison behind. Civilization would have to rebuild itself, forging a future from the ashes of conflict. Amidst the swirl of political announcements, Jack and Zell returned to the Maelstrom for the last of the system's checks. The quantum stabilizer thrummed with readiness. All compartments were refueled. Their battered vessel now stood on the threshold of new voyages. Jack walked down the corridor toward the cabin where Zell was finalizing some calibrations. He found her reading from a Graian data tablet, likely scanning star charts or historical records. She looked up at him, her expression pensive. He cleared his throat. "We can leave now," he said. "The war is done here, as far as I'm concerned." Zell set aside the tablet. Her eyes flickered with numerous questions. Did she still have ties to the Graian people? A family lost in the war? A home she once knew? Would she search for them or accept a new life aboard a Terran ship? Jack hesitated, then spoke carefully, using the few Graian words he had learned combined with Terran. "Your choice? Come with me, or find your people?" She swallowed hard, scanning his face for sincerity. Then, with deliberate effort, she managed a soft, tremulous phrase. "I stay with you." Jack felt an unexpected surge of relief and gratitude. "All right," he whispered. "Then let's chart a course together." She nodded, stepping closer. In that moment, they both recognized how far they had come. For Jack, she was no longer a symbol of the Dominion's conquest, but a partner, an ally who had patched his ship and his wounded soul. For Zell, he was no longer just another Terran captor, but a man who had offered freedom and respect. Yet even as this bond solidified, Jack recalled the harsh realities awaiting them. The galaxy, vast and still scarred by war, would offer no easy welcome. Prejudice and distrust lurked on every planet. But at least they would face it together. The Maelstrom lifted off from Guinea's surface one final time, leaving behind the place where war had ended and partnership began. Jack steered them through the thinning atmosphere, clouds streaking past the viewports. Zell sat at the co-pilot station, verifying readings in Graian script. The planet's horizon curved beneath them, awash in the orange glow of sunset. Within moments, the emptiness of space opened before them, a dark canvas dotted by stars. Jack engaged the newly repaired hyperdrive. The ship trembled slightly, then stabilized. A swirl of starlight blurred, signifying the jump to faster-than-light travel. He glanced at Zell. Her eyes were on the shimmering cosmic tapestry. Perhaps she, too, marveled at how quickly fortunes could change, from captivity to co-captaincy. On her face, Jack thought he detected a flicker of both anticipation and apprehension. The unknown beckoned them forward. As the maelstrom soared into the star-strewn void, the hum of the engines a steady companion, Jack, Grayson, and Zell embarked on a shared path. Not as master and slave, not as Terran and Graian, but as two individuals forging a fragile trust in a galaxy that had witnessed too much hatred. They did not know what awaited them. But for the first time in years, Jack felt something like hope. And, in the quiet corner of the cockpit, he sensed Zell's presence as a gentle, living promise that peace could be more than an interlude between wars. Months later, a lone Corvette-class starship entered orbit around a lush, unnamed planet brimming with life. Jungle canopies stretched across the land mass below, teeming with vibrant flora visible even from space. In the cockpit of the Maelstrom, Jack Grayson flipped a few switches. The planet's atmosphere beckoned. This would be a brief stop, an expedition to gather supplies, water, and perhaps a bit of rest. A quiet haven far from the scars of conflict. Zell studied the sensors. She had grown adept at Terran controls, blending them with her own grand knowledge. Her once hesitant steps had become assured. The language barrier had gradually eroded. They now shared a mix of Terran and Graian words, forging a private dialect. A flick of the thrusters guided them downward, a plume of dust swirling as the Maelstrom touched down in a clearing near a waterfall. Towering trees stretched overhead, a chorus of alien birds singing in welcome. They ventured out onto soft grass, inhaling the sweet, humid air. Together, they explored the surroundings. Jack found fruit-laden vines near the waterfall, while Zell collected samples of the planet's crystal-like rocks, analyzing them with keen scientific curiosity. The war felt a million light-years away. In a quiet moment by the cascading water, Jack turned to Zell. She stood at the edge of a pool, her reflection shimmering, her eyes reflecting the gentle sunlight. He stepped close, his voice tinged with genuine affection. "We did it," he said. "We left the war behind." She smiled, an unguarded, radiant smile, one that needed no translation. Their partnership, born of violence and necessity, had transformed into a bond beyond the constraints of species or fear. They had rescued each other from the ruins of a broken galaxy. Now, they sought new worlds, not to conquer or rule, but to discover and heal. And so their tale continued, among the stars, side by side. Once enemies, now irrevocably bound as allies, friends, and perhaps more, shaping a brighter future in a cosmos that had once seemed irredeemably dark.